The file begins. January 2026. The apology lands not with a bang, but with the flat, dead sound of a body hitting pavement. A full page in the Wall Street Journal. Words chosen with the precision of a surgeon admitting a fatal error on the operating table. I aspire to earn your forgiveness. A plea cast into a void. The industry that had crowned him, then damned him, now offered only silence. A silence thick and heavy, like wet concrete setting around his feet. The Grammy nomination lists were published. Pause. His name was absent. This wasn't an oversight. It was a verdict. An excommunication delivered not by statement, but by omission. The first tangible piece of the coming inventory of loss. The world was not watching a comeback. It was bearing witness to the anatomy of a surrender. The consequences of 2025's fatal mistake were not abstract. They were itemized. A posthumous audit of a living man's empire. The names read like a roll call of the fallen. Pause. Adidas. Pause Gap. Pause Balenciaga. Each partnership, once a pillar of his financial temple, now a pile of rubble. Billions in market value evaporated. The public trust he had commanded, spent like a currency he could never mint again. His brand, once a symbol of defiant luxury, became a contagion. Stores cleared their shelves. Collaborators erased his name from their histories. He was becoming a ghost in his own legacy. This was not merely a financial crisis. Pause. It was the architecture of isolation. The walls of the fortress he built for himself were no longer keeping the world out. They were keeping him in. But the first walls were not made of concrete and public opinion. Pause. They were made of sound, forged in a Chicago bedroom from sampled soul and a relentless, almost pathological hunger. The inventory of his soul begins here. Before the brands, before the billions, there was the beat machine. His mother, Pause Donda, a professor, provided the foundation, not just of love, but of unwavering belief in his exceptionalism, a belief that would later curdle into a God complex. He abandoned university, an act not of rebellion, but of supreme confidence. It was the first entry in a long ledger of gambles against the house. His early production for others, for Rockefeller, was the work of a master craftsman begging for an apprenticeship. He was building thrones for kings, all while knowing he was the rightful emperor. This was the anatomy of his ascent. A climb fueled by a simple, terrifying engine. The fear of being average. The record deal was not a prize. It was a concession. The gold chain they gave him felt less like a crown and more like a collar. A gilded leash for the house producer. The car accident of 2002 was not a tragedy. It was a metamorphosis. A jaw wired shut became a microphone. The song Through the Wire was not a debut single. It was a proof of life statement, a bloody defiant birth. The College Dropout wasn't just an album. It was a manifesto against the gatekeepers. He was no longer asking for a seat at the table. He was building his own, from mahogany and platinum plaques. The perception of invincibility began to set in. Each Grammy was a brick in his fortress of ego. Each fashion venture, from the pink polos to the shutter shades, was a territorial claim. He was becoming a genre unto himself. This was the blueprint for the empire. Pause. And every blueprint for an empire is also a map of its future ruins. The ruins began not with a bang, but with the dry rustle of paper, summonses, affidavits, the anatomy of a fall, cataloged in legalese. The first wave was quiet. Lawsuits from touring staff over unpaid wages, dismissed as the cost of doing business. Then came the copyright claims. A forgotten sample, a borrowed melody, each one a small crack in the fortress walls. The real tremors started when the empire turned on itself. The lawsuit from Pause. George Floyd's family wasn't about money. It was a moral indictment, a $250 million verdict on a single reckless statement. His words, once his greatest asset, were now his most expensive liability. The corporate partners, once eager supplicants, now ran for the exits. The termination clauses in their contracts, once dormant legalese, became execution orders. Pause, Adidas. Pause Gap. Pause Balenciaga. One by one, the pillars of his financial temple were pulled down. The phone stopped ringing. The collaborators vanished. This wasn't just a financial loss. It was an excommunication. Pause. The official cost was tallied at over $1 billion. The unofficial cost was his name. The name was gone, but the evidence remained. For every public statement, there were hours of unedited tape. Digital ghosts in the machine. The real inventory of sins wasn't in the court filings. It was on hard drives, locked in network vaults. Footage from interviews that was deemed too extreme for even the most controversy-hungry networks. In these digital coffins, the mask wasn't just slipping, it was gone. Here he laid out his theories not as provocations, but as gospel. The paranoia was no longer subtext. It was the entire text. We see him outlining plans for a private, walled community. A life lived entirely within the shadow of a bunker, both literal and psychological. Then came the depositions from former Yeezy employees. They spoke of a loyalty tax, a culture where non-disclosure agreements were not legal documents, but vows of silence. Breaking them meant total annihilation. But as the ship sank, the vows became worthless. Leaked emails revealed the chaos behind the curtain. The fatal mistake wasn't the anti-Semitism. Pause. It was the belief that he could document his own descent into madness, and that no one would ever press play. And someone did press play. The first betrayal wasn't a stranger with a grudge. It was the inner circle. The men who stood behind him in photographs, their faces obscured by shadows, were the first to sell the keys to the digital tomb. The loyalty tax was revealed to be simple retainer. When the payment stopped, the silence was put up for auction. Friendships weren't broken. They were liquidated. His public apology, printed on expensive paper in January 2026, was an artifact of this new reality. A desperate plea for market correction. But the market had already priced him out. The letter wasn't seen as remorse. It was read as a balance sheet entry under liabilities. The isolation became physical. The calls stopped. The invitations to the Met Gala and the Grammys were not just rescinded. His name was scrubbed from guest lists past a digital ghost. The bunker was no longer a psychological state. It was four walls, a closed gate, and the crushing weight of a silence once filled with applause. The anatomy of his financial ruin was a masterclass in gravity. It wasn't a fall, it was a demolition. The Adidas contract wasn't a pillar of the empire, it was the only pillar. Once it was gone, the entire structure imploded. The comeback album, Bully, arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet thud of unsold inventory. The partnership with Gamma, hailed as a new beginning, was just a new way to accrue debt. He was no longer the asset, he was the client, paying for studio time that produced nothing but echoes. The YZY bodysuit wasn't a fashion statement, it was a fire sale, a desperate attempt to liquidate the last scraps from a derelict warehouse. The rumored India tour dissolved into canceled flights and forfeited deposits. The festival in Italy became a footnote, a performance to a half-empty field of morbid curiosity seekers. His assets were seized with cold, bureaucratic efficiency. The Wyoming ranch, the minimalist Calabasas compound, the fleet of matte black vehicles. All were fed into the unforgiving machinery of the auction house. His net worth wasn't measured in millions. Pause. It was measured in debt. The man who once claimed godhood was now just another name on a creditor's list, his legacy reduced to the bitter taste of foreclosure. The open letter in the Wall Street Journal was not a reset. It was a formal notice of surrender printed on expensive paper. The apology for his sins was a currency he no longer possessed, and the market for his remorse was closed. Then came the album, Bully. Released in March 2026, it landed not with a shockwave, but with the hollow thud of a body dropped into an empty well. The industry that had once dissected his every syllable now offered him its most profound insult. Pause. Silence. No think pieces. No outrage. Just the cold digital indifference of streaming algorithms bearing it under mountains of more relevant data. The Grammy Awards didn't ban him. They simply forgot to print his name on the guest list. He had become a ghost at a feast he once catered. His final public statements were not broadcasts, but whispers into a dead microphone, fragments of old genius lost in the static of irrelevance. The empire wasn't just in ruins. It was a heritage site, a place people pointed to as a warning, its last king wandering the empty halls unheard. The posthumous audit of Kanye West begins here, in the silence. To understand the collapse, one must first inventory the materials of his ascent. The same obsessive focus that perfected a beat was the one that fixated on an enemy. The same messianic belief that filled stadiums was the one that declared him a god, answerable to none. His genius was not a gift. It was a high-interest loan from a predator he carried inside his own skull. The brain injury, the bipolar diagnosis, these are not excuses. They are the geological fault lines upon which he knowingly built his golden city. Every triumph was a tremor, every masterpiece a portent of the inevitable earthquake. His greatest fear was in never being hated, it was being ignored. And his fate, in its perfect, cruel irony, granted him his deepest terror as a final legacy. He didn't burn out. He was simply unplugged. The bitter testament of is that the brightest light casts the darkest shadow, and sometimes the only thing left of a supernova is the infinite, cold vacuum it leaves behind. His final work was not an album. It was the void itself.